So here's my attempt to provide you with some tools to understand Thomas Aquinas' politics and law. What I've done here with this PDF file is create these little comment bubbles, and these are basically my notes for each of the sections where I see something is significant to what we're doing in class. So I'll be sure to post a copy of this on the website. That way you can refer back to it as you need to. So let's start by looking here at this italicized part, and the beginning is just some background information about Thomas and when he was born and so forth. The most significant part, though, is down here where it talks about how Thomas Aquinas wanted to synthesize, so bring together Christian thought, particularly as it relates to St. Augustine, so Catholicism, and classical philosophy, so Aristotle and so forth. Most specifically, what Aquinas is going to do throughout the entire piece is he's going to use this notion that Aristotle put forward, that man is what he calls a political animal. And that means that man is naturally inclined to be involved in civic pursuits, part of a community, and forming a society as a result of that. So the section that I've provided for you, you can see, is just an excerpt from a much longer piece, and that's the title of it here. So if you look at the structure, Aquinas starts off fairly straightforward enough with the essence of law, and so what is the true sense of law? And what Aquinas will do several different times is he will use rhetorical questions, starting off here, and then throughout you can see over on this side, and then follow that up with his answers. So this first one, the question he asks, is law a matter of reason? And if you read the first sentence, law is a rule or measure of action by which one is led to action or restrained from acting. Basically, just as I said here, to translate or explain is that law either makes man do something, so it leads us to action, or it can keep us from doing something. And that term that he uses, he just talks about the derivative of it here is to bind, so in the sense that it makes us act. Further down in this section, Aquinas is pointing out that for proper laws to be instituted, proper in the sense of meaning just and appropriate, that those laws need to be based on reason. So emotion, passion, and those other things should not be the basis for law. It's reason alone that should dictate all the laws that man must follow or create and follow. So the second question he asks, is law always directed towards the common good? And as I mentioned, this is one of those rhetorical devices he'll use throughout the piece. Now, this idea of common good is significant because at the heart of what Aquinas is saying, as well as Aristotle and the classical philosophers, is that society should be structured in such a way that it is best for all members of the society. Now, you can imagine some difficulties that might entail in our society today, but that's the ideal and the goal of society is for the common good. It's really quite clear if you look at this sentence here where it says, therefore, law must concern itself in particular with the happiness of the community. So a law that is properly created will always be focusing on what is good for all of the community. Now the third area that Aquinas is going to look at is, can any person make law? And what I want you to note here is he lists 1, 2, 3 objections, essentially. Again, using a device where he can put forward questions, and then down below here, where it says reply, 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 he's going to be answering those very questions. So some of this here deals with law of the church and so forth, and he references St. Paul, and then we've got some of our classical philosopher here, Aristotle. As I mentioned, he has these objections, and essentially these are arguments that he's just going to put out there, and then ultimately down below you can see where he brings in his own response and says that I answer that properly speaking. So no matter what the objections that were listed before, what Aquinas is going to say is that in this section here is the most significant information. Let me just hover over this for a second. You can see I think this is fairly important. It references back to that idea of what the purpose of law is. Anything that doesn't follow these guidelines of being for the common good, what's best for everybody, best for the community. Aquinas will say later on that these laws are, unjust or that they should not be followed. And to these objections before, making the argument, or people are making the argument that, some people think that they can make their own laws, that, a ruler or a household, the father of family, they can make rules for the society, but it's not quite the same as laws for an entire community. So again, the last part here, well, no one can make laws just because he or she feels like it. Laws should benefit all people, and the responsibility for making law is in all of us individually or in that of our elected officials. So in his reply to this first objection, Thomas Aquinas sets out that we are all involved in some aspect of the law because maybe we're involved in creating of the law or in somehow the application of it. For most citizens in any type of society, they're involved with the law because of the protection that it might provide them. You think about the police force providing you protection, or if you are involved in criminal activity or an activity that somehow goes against the law, you're going to feel the force of it through the constraints. So even though not all of us are legislatures, not all of us are politicians, we are all involved with the law because it's within us, and also being members of a community. Going back to Aristotle's political animal, the law has some sort of effect on us, regardless of our position in society. Now, throughout the piece, you're going to see this term virtue, and I'm sure I'll repeat myself several times, but it's significant in understanding there's multiple ways of looking at virtue. If we think about it from Aristotle's perspective, it deals with being involved in the community, those types of civic virtues. And what Thomas Aquinas says here is that, and I think common experience may provide some insight into this as well, is that none of us can really force anyone else to be virtuous. And so moral virtue in this case has to do with feeling, choosing, and acting well. So you can provide guidance, suggestion, but as he says just above here, has no power of compulsion. And so we may want people to act virtuous, morally right, good, part of the community, but you can't force people. Individually, you can't force someone else to act that way. Now, if I individually can't force someone to be virtuous, there is some power, as Aquinas says, the power of compulsion belongs to the whole people. And this can be thought of as social customs, norms, or laws that are passed by the entire community to force people to act a certain way. Down below here, Aquinas is just going into a structure about how society is layered. And it's kind of a neat way to think about it is if it starts with the individual, and of course he says man, and we can take this to mean man, women, as being part of a household. And as I hover over my notes here, if an individual is acting virtuous, upright, and he establishes his household to be in such a way that there are laws and rules that are focused on the good of those people in the house, and then his neighbors are doing the exact same thing. So now we have an entire neighborhood of virtuous people that makes up the greater community, and they're all focused on the common good. So it really starts with that individual person acting in such ways that are virtuous, that are in the guidelines of the law. Of course, the law is focused on the common good. So if we start at that point, then it goes to the households, and it goes to the neighborhood, and the whole community, and then the rest is society. So it's these layers upon layers that make up the common good. I just went to the next page here, so we're starting over here on number 4. And the language here just means to announce. Promulgation just means to announce the law. I can see this looks like it's cut off a little bit here, but it's just basically meaning that a law is not really a law until it's known. And that just makes, I think, sense to us naturally, is that until a law is announced or until a law is put on the books or somehow brought up in a community, it's not really a law. It may be something else, a guiding principle, but it's truly not a law. This last line here discusses the idea that laws are created by people society are representatives to government, and these laws are always going to be based on reason and focused on the common good. Now, later on, he will talk about laws that are unjust or laws that are not focused on the common good. But in essence here, that laws are derived from people. Go back to that image of virtuous person, virtuous household, virtuous neighborhood, and virtuous community. And so if all of those things are true, and Thomas Aquinas thinks they are, then laws that come from those communities for the rest of society will also be good. Hopefully this next section here, the kinds of law, should be fairly familiar to you because we've talked about it in class as it relates back to the Scarlet Letter. You remember the various settings where we see nature's law out in the forest by the brook, we see man's law in the courthouse and on the scaffold, and of course we see God's law as it relates to the church. So Aquinas is essentially setting out, okay, what are the different types of laws? This first one here is an eternal law, and it's I really think about it as kind of a connection to natural law. And what's interesting about this, and this is a pretty fascinating thing about Thomas Aquinas, is that although he is a religious figure, he really thought that understanding God should be done as a science. And one of the ways that he put his arguments is to use logic. And in a simple logic statement is to make a proposition that if this is true, then this also is true. So what we have here is Aquinas saying that God, or he also calls it the divine, is universal and eternal, and that's his starting point. And so if God, the divine, is universal and eternal, there must be some sort of eternal laws. Specifically, he says that God, or the divine, is ruler of the universe, and no ruler would create a universe or create an environment that he wanted to see destroyed, because that would be an unreasonable thing to do. It would go against reason. So that's his next point, that God the divine is a rational or reasonable ruler. Additionally, God the divine is not fixed in time, so it's that sense of eternal timeless, has always been and always will. And finally, that God the divine would not rule irrationally. So there has to be some sort of eternal law, and that eternal law is going to be a rational one. If you take it away from God for just a moment, you would think about an earthly ruler and the person who would create a kingdom or a community that would continue beyond him, and so it would be irrational for that person to act in ways that are destructive to that community, or it's destructive to that person's kingdom and rule. This eternal law does kind of have this connection to a natural law, and if I hover over this part, you can see it's starting here and continuing to the end of the sentence. We see Thomas Aquinas in his main point deals with instinct. And I put instinct in capitalization here on purpose, and to emphasize it's a anyways, it's a real tangible idea, but it's also a metaphysical and metaphorical instinct. And so what Aquinas is saying is that instinct rules all creatures, self-preservation, all those things that we've talked about in natural law, whether they relate back to Hester Prynne, Dimmesdale, forces of nature, laws of physics, and so forth. Those are all natural, and there's nothing that can be done to change those because they're always going to be present. And humans, as part of that, and animals, as part of that, are going to act in accordance with those inclinations, and they just can't help themselves. But farther down here, Aquinas is going to say that, to this point here, that all creatures are governed by instinct, and we can mean man this too, but humans, we do have something that's different within us, is that we have this ability to be reasonable and to have the ability to see consequences and to be empathetic and all those other things that are unique to human understanding that other animals don't. So we've got this interesting blend of things that where we are driven by instinct, but we also have something that can supersede those things, and as he calls it, is reason. Thinking again back to this idea of eternal law, if we're all made in God's image, Aquinas has said that God is a rational being, and therefore we must be rational beings as well. And so we're capable of making laws, and we call these, of course, man's law. Just this part here, if I go backwards, basically states that as humans, there's some things that we are driven by naturally, are those inclinations or those instincts. But we do also have to observe and experience to learn things. Is that there are some things that, unlike heightened senses that maybe animals have, humans don't have those. And it's through our understanding and our experiences that we can better understand those. So over here, the question he poses: was there a need for divine law? And my little comment here is that note how long this section is. And so truly it's going to give you the idea that Aquinas thinks that this is very important to his overall thesis. This section here where it says, besides the natural law and human law, it's necessary to have the divine law to direct human life. And he'll list off the 4 different reasons. But essentially, one of the main points is that man can't get to the whatever our final end. Of course, Aquinas, in his mind, that's going to be heaven. But if we take away the religious side of that, it could be whatever may happen in the afterlife, if such a thing exists. But regardless, that there is a need for some sort of divine guidance, and that's where we get this idea of divine law. Down here at this point, Aquinas is saying that man needs, to have help to make the right decisions. And it's because although we may be rational, there's also these instincts within us, and oftentimes we need to have some sort of guidance for a higher morality of thinking. This whole next section, he talks about how laws can be made to judge actions, but it's only that only God can truly know the heart of man, and it's the bubble here should be able to judge them, not to fail to judge them. So we can have these laws, as he says. Thirdly, man can make laws about matters that are capable of being judged, so things that are observed, things that you can truly see. But man can't make judgments about internal motivations that are hidden, so only God is able to do that. The last little point down here is that, of course, in the classical religious thinking, only God can punish evil acts. And if if a man commits a crime in life and gets away with it, ultimately there'll be some sort of punishment from God. So it's an interesting way that Aquinas lays this out here, especially going back to this third point that man can make laws that are capable of for events that are to be judged, but there's an internal motivation, and we never know exactly why people are doing those things, and only God would know. The last section on this page here are the effects of law, and again, rhetorical device is the effect of law to make men good. Just the main idea here is that only laws which are truly directed towards the common good, we've heard that a couple of different times now, can also have the effect to make men good. And so if we have laws that are directed against virtuous ideas or against making man behave in such a way that is good, then those laws, in fact, are not good. And that's the point that he makes here, as I just switch the page, that although laws may be enacted that are wrong, or in the sense perverse, meaning going against what is right and what is good, they're not true laws. And so if you go back to that first line of the whole document, it says, law is a rule and measure of action by which one is led to action or restrained from acting. So there can be laws that restrain people from acting, but if those laws are put into effect that are against the common good or against natural rights, if you want to think of it that way, then those laws do not have the same force as laws that are good and that laws are just. And moreover, that you don't need to obey those laws. And we have to remember the principle that Aquinas is operating on here, and that is that naturally man wants to do what is right, good, or virtuous. Sometimes we just need some help, and that's why we have these human laws that are put into effect. Now, sometimes people will act in accordance with law simply because there's fear of being punished, and that's the idea of, like a little child following a rule simply because they don't want something to be taken away from them or for them to be punished. And then ultimately, those children may follow those laws over time voluntarily, but initially there are people who only follow laws because they're afraid of getting caught or having some sort of a punishment. This is really a great part here. It's one of my favorite pieces of the whole section. Um, and it explores this idea of human nature. And it'll come up again when we start looking at the Constitution with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. And the line is, man is the noblest, starts right here, noblest of all animals if he is perfect in virtue, but if he departs from law and justice, he is the worst. So we know that Aquinas thinks that within human nature there is this ability to be good and the ability to be noble and virtuous. And when that is realized, man is at his best. And when it's not, of course, the opposite is true. Man is at his worst. Now, I've skipped over this longer piece right here. It's definitely worth reading. But the point that I want to make is up here with this little quote bubble. And what's interesting about this section, the title, should law repress all vices? I think it's a very subtle point, but it's significant in that law should be created to prohibit certain crimes, especially those that harm others. Now, the question that I would pose is that is it necessary to have laws when there are no victims? To have victimless crimes. Is it even possible to have such a thing? Now, some people, mainly people who believe that government should stay out of people's affairs, would agree with this. Is that laws for things like homicide, theft, and so forth are necessary and important to have in a society, but so-called victimless laws, and these could be laws dealing with drug use, it could be laws dealing with personal safety, it could be laws dealing with consenting adults, but if there's really no crime involved or no victim involved, should there be some sort of prohibition against those particular acts? And we'll come back and talk about this more when we look at the Constitution and the formation of the laws and the ideas that it put forward a little bit later. The last little bit here deals with Aquinas' idea about laws that are against the common good. And I've mentioned this a couple of different times already. But just to recap, Aquinas says that these tyrannical laws that are somehow unfair, corrupt, against the common good, that those are laws that should not be followed. Now, I've given you two examples here. Following the Civil War, there were laws that restricted African Americans' right or access to voting, owning property, serving on jury trials, and so forth. So those were actual laws that were put on the books in a lot of southern states, and yet those laws, according to Aquinas, and I think according to most people, would be seen as corrupt or unfair. Additionally, you look at women getting the access to the full vote. There were laws that prohibited women from being able to do that. Ultimately, those are going to be changed as we have amendments to the Constitution. So basically, anything that goes against unalienable rights, those rights that we talked about in class, expressed through the Declaration of Independence and so forth, anything that goes against those, Aquinas would say that those laws are unjust and that those laws should not be followed. I just put this question here, and it relates to the quote to the side of it. A law that is unjust is considered to be no law at all, and I think that's an interesting contention, and maybe in class we can explore that a little bit more. His last point here, of course, Thomas Aquinas is a saint, and so there's going to be the religious connotations that comes along with it. And here we see the conviction that's coming through, and he's using the same arguments from above, but also then applying it to God. Suddenly, law may be unjust because it's contrary to divine goodness. So either it's against the common good for the people, or it's against God's what's good for the soul of people. And then if that's the case, then of course laws should be ignored. And so this would be like laws requiring people to worship idols. Well, that goes against God's law, and so that law should be ignored. Now, this is an interesting one. Is everyone subject to the law? Now, Aquinas is going to say yes, but he's going to say no at the exact same time. And if I go down to this last bubble and kind of skip over the actual language and give you just kind of my summation here, is fairly straightforward. If you think about a ruler who has complete power, that ruler makes the laws, enforces the laws, and therefore is above the law. There's nobody, no earthly being that can require a ruler to follow those laws that he's created already. No way to coerce that person to obey the laws. Ultimately, of course, God will be able to. But Aquinas says that a ruler should voluntarily follow his own laws. It'll be interesting to look at Machiavelli's The Prince if you have some time to see what Machiavelli said about rulers following the laws that they've put forward there and whether or not it's a good thing for the ruler and a good thing for its people. Aquinas would say here that the ruler should voluntarily follow his own laws. Those laws should be just anyway, so it would be reasonable to expect a ruler to follow those just like his people would. Down here, I've just given you the definition for precepts, and it's just a general rule to regulate behavior or thought. So having that in mind as we go forward will be helpful. Part of this piece here, Thomas Aquinas is going to include these ideas of morality, and he says in this first sentence, moral precepts are distinct from ceremonial and judicial precepts, basically just meaning that rules for ceremony and judicial proceedings are different than that of morality. To provide you with the summary of this sentence that starts here, since human moral conduct is directed by reason, which is the basic principle of human action, those moral actions that are in accord with reason are called good, and those that depart from reason are called evil. Basically, what it means is that when we follow the things that are in natural rights, in agreement with natural rights, we're operating what I would consider the realm of good. And when we stray from those or go against natural right law, then we're operating in that area that is evil. And so if I skip to the next page here, you can see that Aquinas says that morality is not subjective. So that means it doesn't change over time. It's not open to interpretation. It's not open to changes within culture or from community to community. These moral precepts are timeless, like the divine. And so it's necessary times to judge the action. Oh, and then additionally, he'll say that although that may be true, that these things are timeless, it is important at some venture or junction that in cases in which different circumstances must be taken into account in order to make a decision. And so just to hover over my note here again is that sure, morality is timeless and these ideas are not open to interpretation. We do need to keep in mind the circumstances in which the act was committed. When we get into the Constitution, we'll be spending some time looking at moral reasoning and the different levels of moral reasoning that people use in their decision-making process. And so this will be something we'll return to time and time again, that just because the act in and of itself is wrong, the circumstances in which it's committed needs to be. Now, what I like about this next part here is it goes beyond a little bit of the theoretical into things that are maybe a little more concrete to us as we look at how government should be organized. And most significantly, that government, it's important for it to be organized and it deals fairly with its people. And so that's what this rather long section is all about. Coming down to this quote balloon here, it's the most significant part of the entire section, not necessarily the entire piece, but this one here of the reasons for judicial precepts. And I've given you the simple way to think about it here. And just like we looked at a household and then the individuals in a household, a neighborhood, a community, and beyond that are the layers that make up a society. What Aquinas is saying here is that in Aristotle's view of things, we've got this enlightened statesman, or we've got this this ruler who is a virtuous person, and then below him are lawmakers, governors, and other people who are likewise virtuous. And those people enact laws and enforce laws that are for the betterment of all the people in the community, because that's a rational thing to do. And it's also a Aristotle lays this idea out in the sense of a kingdom, but as you can probably see, there's ways that we can apply this to our own democracy, and Aquinas even talks about it down here when he mentions democracy and so forth. So um, it's a significant way of looking at how governments should be organized, and the application to our own government, I think, is fairly clear. Now, of course, the argument might be made that not all rulers, of course, are just, and laws that they institute may not be just. So you have to go back to the original argument that Aquinas made, is that those laws, although they may have the force to coerce people to act in such ways, they're not true laws. And so politicians who are corrupt, or politicians who are somehow not looking out for the betterment and of the common good, do not truly represent what is virtuous and what is right about the forms of government. This last little bit here, I just think is important to focus on, because when I keep saying virtue here, there's a number of ways to think about it. In Aristotle, he holds this idea that humans act in virtuous ways. Civic virtue is a term that he would use for it, because that is what's best for community. And of course, a person wants to live in a community that is, viable and healthy and works and so forth. And just like we had the image of starting with the individual in the home and so forth, Aristotle here argues that virtues that are taught to the youth, and everyone's responsible for teaching virtue to the youth, starting at that point in time with young people, instilling in them the sense of community involvement, whether it's volunteerism or caring for your neighbors, looking out for each other. And starting with that point will lead to a virtuous society. All right, so just wrapping it up here, the final section Aquinas looks at: can man will or do anything good without grace? And this goes back to, or it starts off by talking about human nature. And Aquinas essentially is saying that there's two ways to think about it. We can either think about it as blank slate, which is that John Locke idea, tabula rasa, or corrupted and sinful at birth. And he'll go through the entire argument looking at both of those perspectives. But although it's important, I think, to read through that, it does tend to have more religious connotations until we get to this final bit here. And if we take out some of those connotations, and we can see how laws are necessary for society. And there's two reasons. One is that laws are instituted that are to help us maintain our purity, or to seek our best self. They're to elevate, to improve, to benefit us personally and benefit our community. And secondly, to correct us when we go astray. And so you can think about laws, our own constitution, like freedom of speech. That's a law that's for the betterment of all of us, as compared to a law that maybe is restrictive in the sense of punishing people for doing something illegal. So that's my little take on Thomas Aquinas. As I mentioned before, I do recommend that you read through it on your own so you can try to get an understanding, using this either as a way of introducing it to yourself, or a way of following up on it. And remember, for homework, to try to come up with a couple of clarifying questions that you have for this piece and from the John Locke piece, or a couple discussion type questions.